And now, marine weather around Alaska.
All right, taking a look at the sea ice analysis from 1 week ago, last Saturday, we'll see it was the heavier ice was back in close to the southwest coast here, especially south of Nunivak Island. And then we had a narrow strip extending down to St. Matthew Island area and kind of northeast Bristol Bay. And then looking at today's sea ice analysis a week later, you can see it's made a very good jog to the southwest there, and especially a big increase here over Bristol Bay, Cook Inlet as well as Kamishak Bay. Let me back that up one more time. From the last week, not much of a southward push over northern Cook Inlet, but definitely some thicker ice there over Kamishak Bay. And this whole pattern will continue for the next several days to advance southwestward. And for tonight's weather, increasing clouds, increasing snow over the southeast interior, clear and very cold over the central part of the state, all the way out to the Arctic coast, temperatures below zero. Snow for the Pribilofs, maybe some gusty winds as that low crosses the area there. And for the southeast coast, rain and wind up to the eastern North Gulf Coast. And for tomorrow, high wind warning out for the southern panhandle as this frontal complex begins to tighten the gradient up down there. Could see gusts over 65 miles an hour. Snow increasing, spreading westward during the day into northern Cook Inlet from the Manuska Valley, spreading into the Susitna Valley, as well as much of the eastern interior areas, but still clear and cold, well below zero for the central and western part of the state out to the Arctic coast. And still cold for the Pribilofs down to the Aleutians with numerous snow showers out there. That continues, really no change into Monday out west there. It'll be a little milder with, especially on the low temperatures due to the clouds and snow, as a strong low here tracks right up to the Kenai Peninsula. Look for snow heavy at times here across southern Alaska, especially in the Copper River Basin and northeast Prince William Sound. All of Prince William Sound, actually, back to the eastern Kenai Peninsula. Warm, wet, and windy for the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast, south winds 30 knots for the southern coast here, the Panhandle, otherwise Clarence Strait. Southeast 30, gusting 40 knots. South to southeast winds 35 knots. So gale warnings for the central coast and the north coast, south to southeast winds 25 to 40 knots. Southeast 20, gusting 35 knots for Stevens Passage, and southeast winds at 20 knots for Lynn Canal. And then for Monday, storm warnings for much of the southeast coast here, all from the south at about 50 knots, except Prince of Wales Island, south 45 knots, seas 20 to 22 feet here on the south coast, and 15 to 18 feet in the north coast. Small craft advisory, central and northern inside waters, south winds 25 knots, and a good gale for Clarence Strait, south at 40 knots with 10-foot seas. Prince William Sound tomorrow, northwest wind 15 knots. Otherwise, variable winds 10 to 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north at 20 knots for the western coast. Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, northwest winds at 30 knots. Variable winds, light and variable winds for northern Cook Inlet, but south of the Foreland, small craft advisories, winds will be north at 25 knots. Then on Monday, southeast winds here, 20 knots, northern Cook Inlet, even probably stronger east winds there coming out of Turnagain Arm, then west 25 knots south of the Forelands, 45 knot westerlies for the Kamishak Bay area, turn northwest at 40 knots for the Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, southeast winds 30 knots for Prince William Sound with 7-foot seas, Kodiak Island, north winds 30 knots for Sunday. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, north at about 20 there for Bristol Bay. And for Kodiak Island on Monday, west winds 40 knots, seas 8 to 15 feet. Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest winds 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, for Unalaska Island, gale warnings, west winds 35 to 40 knots. Back toward Nikolsky, northwest at 30 knots with 8 to 12-foot seas. And for Adak and Atka, northwest winds 20 knots. Lighter out here to the west from the north and northwest at 15 to 20 knots. And for Monday, western Aleutians, west winds 15 to 20 knots, west winds 20 knots for Adak and Atka. Small craft advisories for the eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 25 knots. And for the southwest coast here, south of Nunivak Island, brisk wind advisory tomorrow, north winds at 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Pribilofs. Northeast, 35 knots, seas 11 feet. Variable at 20 for St. Matthew Island. Pretty light winds now. Northern Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound there, Yukon Delta coast, all out of the north or northwest at 5 to 10 knots. And Monday, northwest at 10 for Norton Sound, north 15, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, north at 20 there for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwest 20 for the Pribilofs, and northeast 25 for St. Matthew Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, we've got up here west winds at 10 knots, not too bad. Real light variable winds now for the central coast at about 5 knots. East to northeast, 10 to 15 knots for the western Arctic coast, and light winds to the Chukchi Sea out of the north and northwest. Those winds increase. Brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea on Monday. North winds 20 to 25 knots. And central western Arctic coast winds will be out of the north at about 10 knots. And west to north winds 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.